It is June 1985. Two men in the same city, the same age, with the same income, each hold a $50,000 check. The money came from the same source, a grandparent who died with a simple instruction to use it to build something. Tom, an accountant, puts his entire $50,000 into a Vanguard 500 index fund. He follows a passive strategy. He reinvests every dividend, ignores the market fluctuations, and never sells a share. Marcus, an electrician, avoids the stock market. He takes the exact same $50,000 and uses it as a 20% down payment on a $250,000 four-unit apartment building, taking on a $200,000 mortgage at 9.5%. Tom's index fund costs almost nothing to hold and carries no debt. Marcus, however, takes on property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and a mandatory monthly mortgage payment that must be satisfied regardless of whether his units are occupied. By June 2025, after 40 years of economic turbulence, the gap between their accounts is measured in millions of dollars. The discrepancy is vast, yet neither man ever deviated from his original strategy. The final results of this 40-year tracking are not a matter of opinion. They are the result of an absolute mathematical divergence. The mainstream debate over stocks versus real estate is often a tribal argument. It usually ignores the specific mechanics of how wealth actually grows under different conditions. The terminal wealth of these two men was dictated by the sequence of their investments, the size of the monthly surplus behind those assets, and the structural costs that the sales pitches rarely mention. This is a forensic historical audit of American financial data. We are tracking the real numbers from 1985 to 2025 to see where the math actually bends. Mastering the timing of these mathematical rules determines whether your capital grows at a linear pace or an exponential one. To understand the gap, we have to look at the math underneath the initial 1985 deployment. Most comparisons between stocks and real estate fail because they assume the same dollar buys the same amount of both assets. It doesn't. Tom's $50,000 buys $50,000 in stocks. A 10% gain yields $5,000. Capital equals asset. Marcus's $50,000 controls a $250,000 building. 4% depreciation yields $10,000. This multiplier delivers a 20% capital return. But Marcus borrowed $200,000 to get there. At a 9.5% interest rate, he faced an annual interest expense of $19,000. If the building does not produce enough rent to cover the debt and maintenance, Marcus has to pay the difference from his own salary. Leverage magnifies both the total upside and the potential for ruin. The survival of these two strategies depends on how they weather the shocks of the next 40 years. In October 1987, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 22% in a single day. Tom watched his capital evaporate in hours, experiencing the psychological pressure of an asset that is priced every second. Marcus felt no daily panic because his building was not priced by the minute. As long as his tenants stayed and the rent checks arrived, the building's value on paper was secondary to the cash it produced. However, the 1991 recession hit Marcus directly. Manufacturing jobs vanished in Ohio, a tenant defaulted, and Marcus spent 3 months evicting them. He was forced to cover the mortgage shortfall out of his own pocket. This is the surplus principle. Assets survive crises when the owner does not need to sell them. The source of that protection is earned income outside the asset. Both men survived because their paychecks covered their living expenses, allowing their investments to sit untouched. When the tech bubble imploded in 2000, halving Tom's equity, Marcus's localized rent demand remained stable. Electricians in Ohio did not stop paying rent because software companies in California were losing value. Neither asset is universally safe. They are susceptible to different types of economic stress, and each requires a different kind of discipline to survive. The 2008 financial crisis wiped out paper equities and turned real estate leverage into a liability. National home prices fell 27%, and many leveraged investors were wiped out when their equity turned negative. From 2000 to 2013, the S&P 500 delivered 0 real returns. Yet Marcus found that as homeowners lost their houses to foreclosure, they moved back into the rental market, stabilizing his cash flow while his paper net worth dropped. While Tom waited for his stocks to recover, he faced a silent drag. His dividend yields were taxed annually, reducing the total amount of capital left to compound for the next decade. Marcus, meanwhile, operated under a different set of rules. The tax code allowed him to deduct mortgage interest and use depreciation to shield his rental income, meaning his cash flow was largely tax-deferred. Advanced rules like bonus depreciation and 1031 exchanges allowed Marcus to renovate units and roll his equity into larger properties without paying capital gains taxes. He was compounding on a tax-deferred basis that Tom's index fund couldn't match. The tax code provides a structural subsidy for property owners. This benefit shifts the after-tax return, often pushing the real-world growth of real estate past the theoretical returns of stocks. Most investors do not capture the market's full return. From 1994 to 2014, the S&P 500 averaged 9.2%, but the average investor captured 6.7%. This 2.5% difference is the behavior gap. Human biology makes losses feel twice as painful as gains. The daily volatility of the stock market repeatedly triggers this response, causing many people to sell at the exact moment they should be holding. Real estate has its own version of this gap. While the spreadsheets show a high internal rate of return, the actual operator return drops under the weight of the sweat equity discount. Landlording requires hours of uncompensated labor and constant maintenance reserves. If an operator does not account for the value of their time, they are overstating the actual yield of the building. We also have to account for transaction costs. Tom's index fund fees were small and predictable, while Marcus faced high closing costs and commissions every time he bought or sold a property. Passive investing requires extreme emotional discipline to ignore volatility, while real estate requires significant operational labor. Neither system generates wealth for free. After 2008, the Federal Reserve held interest rates near zero for 7 years. This policy increased the value of all assets, but it gave real estate operators an asymmetrical advantage. Marcus was able to refinance his debt at historic lows, slashing his monthly mortgage payments, while his rents continued to rise. This increased his monthly surplus, which he used as a down payment for his next building. However, these results are not guaranteed. An investor in the Japanese stock or property markets in 1990 faced 30 years of stagnation. No amount of discipline can overcome a total market collapse. Locally, the collapse of Detroit showed that geographic concentration can destroy a leveraged operator. Real estate wealth depends on the health of the specific city where the building sits. Federal Reserve data shows us exactly where elite wealth is stored. The top 10% of American households do not hold the majority of their net worth in public stocks. They hold their wealth in private business equity and real estate. In the American system, public equities are often used for secondary liquidity, but the primary wealth engine is the ownership of cash-flowing, productive assets. After 40 years, Tom's passive stock portfolio grew to roughly $2.1 million. His wealth is entirely liquid and required no labor to maintain. The right column shows Marcus's result. He holds roughly $850,000 in property equity, but it produces $50,000 a year in tax-advantaged cash flow. Tom has a higher net worth on paper, but he must liquidate his shares to fund his life. Marcus has a lower paper value, but he owns a machine that produces income every month without him having to sell a single asset. Declaring a winner is impossible without defining the goal. One strategy provides liquid net worth and simplicity, while the other provides perpetual cash flow and tax efficiency. The surplus inflection model turns the stocks versus real estate debate into a mathematical sequence. In Phase 1, when your surplus and capital are low, liquid index funds are the priority. They have no holding costs and allow you to build a base safely while you focus on increasing your income. Once you cross the inflection point with a significant monthly surplus and cash reserves, you can deploy leverage and tax strategies. Real estate becomes an engine to accelerate growth on top of your liquid base. We keep the stock portfolio for liquidity. If you face a personal financial crisis, real estate equity is difficult and expensive to access. The transaction friction of property can leave you cash poor exactly when you need capital the most. A dual-engine portfolio provides a structural offset. It uses the liquidity of stocks to guard against the illiquidity of property, while using the leverage of property to guard against the lower yields of unleveraged stocks. There is one variable that outperformed every asset in this audit: the human capital that funded the initial monthly surplus. This chart compares capital returns. A 10% return on $5,000 gains $500. but a $5,000 investment in a skill that raises your salary by $15,000 nets you that $15,000 every year. In the early years, income expansion has a larger impact on your total balance than any market return. Successful wealth building relies on timing the sequence correctly. Wealth compounds when the surplus funds the asset, and the sequence protects that surplus. Calculate your current monthly investable surplus and identify your phase in the comments below. Execution is the only thing that matters. Find your place in the sequence and go build.